Good morning, good afternoon, good night. This is the 10 times regular speed, ultra fast French Revolution review video for students who were absent and missed a class. We are going to be going fast through this video, partly because it's so late at night I got to get out of the building before I get locked into the building. Here we go at 10 times regular speed. Okay, pause and take a look at the table of contents. This is what we'll be covering in this video really fast. Some basic introduction, background, enlightenment and philosophers, leadership, the revolution begins, crisis and events, people of the revolution, conclusion, causes, and a tiny bit of the impact. Okay, here we go, super fast. Section 1, here we go. These are the things we're going to cover in Section 1. The first fundamental definition you should be aware of is, what is a revolution? Okay, let's take a look at the American Revolution for an example. The American Revolution is also known as the American War of Independence, so it has two different names. So there's a sense where, well, the American War of Independence is a war and it's trying to become independent of Great Britain. So that is some type of definition or an example of a revolution. However, it is also a sudden or radical or complete change. Now, does that mean it could not be semi-sudden? What about, for example, the civil rights movement in Canada, the civil rights movement in the United States of America? That is a change. Could that also be considered a revolution? The province of Quebec in Canada had something called the Quiet Revolution. That's also a change, but it did not necessarily involve violence and war. So revolutions could be something that does not involve war, but it's most often thought of something that does involve some kind of violence. However, there's the Industrial Revolution, which was a change in process. There's also the Scientific Revolution, which is a change in thought. Okay, take a look at definition 2b here. A fundamental change in political organization, especially the overthrow or renunciation of one government or ruler and a substitution of another by govern. So, do revolutions fully change? So the French Revolution also ended up with Napoleon. So the change from having a king to having an emperor. So that's something to think about. So it could also be a change in thinking, a change in technology. Okay, big ideas from the BC curriculum. Emerging ideas and ideologies profoundly influence societies and events. So specifically with the French Revolution, this means the ideas of the Enlightenment and the ideology circulating at the time had a huge impact on the possibility and the causes of the French Revolution. Both the ideas of, say, how feudalism worked, but then people not wanting feudalism any longer. Okay, number 2, the physical environment influences the nature of political, social, economic change. That's the big idea. How does that connect to the French Revolution? Well, there was a great big winter famine where people became hungry afterwards. That also had a huge big impact on the French Revolution. All right, number 3, big idea from the BC curriculum. Disparities in power alter the balance of relationships between individuals and between societies. All right, so with the French Revolution, this one is packed with double meanings, but there's a disparity in power between the various groups in France. The nobility, the clergy are at the top, and then just below the nobility, there's going to be the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class of non-nobility commoners. And then there's going to be the poor commoners and serfs at the bottom of the system. And there's a disparity in power. Now, the people that were leading the French Revolution were the upper middle class of the commoners, not the nobility, well, with some exceptions like Lafayette, who was a noble who joined the side of the revolutionaries. So there's always going to be exceptions to any rule or generalization, so watch out for all or never. Not all the nobles were against the French Revolution. But there were disparities in power radical inequity in power and wealth and justice before the French Revolution, and people did not like that and wanted to change. They wanted more fairness in wealth distribution, they wanted more fairness in power distribution, and they wanted more fairness in access to justice. Okay, collective identity is constructed and can change over time. This big idea is often taught in the context of Canadian history and Canadian identity, but in terms of the French Revolution, there was this time where people in France would identify with being a monarchy in a feudal system. Now, when I say they identified with that, feudal system is a term that historians use, but they would have been a sense of identifying with being part of a monarchy, and people would have felt it's important to be loyal to the king as a value. But then that identity changed over time, where people embraced the idea of a republic. They embraced the idea of considering themselves somebody who did not want a king. And now in modern France, valuing the ideals of the Republic of France, there's some French people that get a lot of joy and identity in sort of identifying with the ideals of the French Revolution. When I say the ideals, I mean the good goals of equality. All right, so identity is constructed and can change over time. And at one point, people can consider themselves pro-monarchy, and then later on, not so much. Moving on, we have a statement of inquiry. Sometimes people want to change systems of law and government and power when they believe systems are unfair and lack real justice. Sample unit question: what are the real reasons for the French Revolution starting in France at the time that it occurred? Is it A, the famine and people are hungry? Is it B, radical wealth inequality? Is it C, radical power inequality? Is it D, social inequality? Is it E, they ran out of money? Is it F, the Enlightenment ideas? And which one of the Enlightenment ideas? So many different ideas floating around. That was a key ingredient that did not exist in other places in Europe in the same extent it existed in France. For example, Russia also had a tough type of feudalism, but a revolution and the end of feudalism came much later to Russia. Why did it come much later to Russia and come earlier to France? Other questions. What were the events of the French Revolution? Why did the French Revolution start? And what were the causes of the French Revolution? And going further to debatable questions that are more open-ended and more debatable. How can I evaluate the causes? Which causes are the most important and why? What recommendations can we make to governments to avoid a revolution in the future? And what actions are justified in bringing about change? And what actions are not justified, ethically justified? How can the French Revolution help us understand solutions to Canadian problems today? After you've learned about the problems people faced in the French Revolution, how can we avoid those same problems in our countries today? One problem they had was radical inequality. How can we reduce radical inequality today? So we can learn from the radical inequality of the past and then consider what we can do to make our country more fair today. And perhaps if it's more fair, there'll be less likely of a chance of a dangerous revolution. And perhaps if radical inequality grows and grows without restraint, we are more at risk of having problems, like the problems of the French Revolution. Okay, so in grade 8, you would have learned about feudalism. In this diagram, you've got the nobility at the top, and then you've got a layer of nobility. The nobility would be including all kinds of terms like barons and dukes and duchesses and lords and ladies. And in France, you would have had a term like a marquis. Okay. And below the nobility would have been the military class, the knights and vassals working closely with the nobility. And within the nobility, it would have been stratified where there would have been major nobles and lesser nobles. But there's this sense of considering where there's this line where you are either a noble or you're not. You're either a lord or lady or you're not. There's a line there, and there's a clear class distinction in terms of your rights and responsibilities and your access to power and your access to certain abilities in the sense of legal rights before the law of the land. All right, so below those classes, below the nobility is all the commoners, including some of the soldiers who are not nobility. There could be soldiers who are nobility, but the soldiers who are not nobility. And then there are, below the soldiers, the bourgeoisie. Now, of course, this pyramid could be a bit fluid. And of course, some of the bourgeoisie could be growing in wealth and quite wealthy relative to some of the other people, depending on which time period. Okay, but what are the bourgeoisie and what are the bottom classes? So the bourgeoisie is basically we could call upper middle class to simplify it, but it would include people like lawyers, doctors, wealthy merchants, people who are a little bit wealthier enough to maybe learn to read and write, often dwelling in the cities, often wealthy because they were trading in the marketplace, or it could be even a skilled craftsman or blacksmith in the city. Now, just remember, though, that all these people are commoners from the noble's perspective. So whether you are a commoner in the military, a commoner who's a doctor, lawyer, or wealthy merchant, or a dirt poor farmer, you're all commoners from the point of view of the nobility. And everybody in this group of commoners in France was called the third estate. It doesn't really matter whether you're poor or rich commoner. Below the bourgeoisie would have been the poor peasants, the poor farmers, below the third estate and other people of poverty. Okay. Above the third estate in France, there would have been the second estate, which is the nobility. And there's a bit of a trick for you. And then who is in the first estate then? Well, the first estate in France would have been the religious class, people who are bishops and priests and other people who have a religious type position. And above that would be the king or the monarch. Okay, we're going to skip over these French line timeline instructions. There's a separate video on YouTube about that, which you can search on YouTube on Mr. Vic's channel, Antoine Vic, French Revolution Timeline. Moving on, this is about the timeline project. We're not going to talk about that in this video. You can pause it there. Okay, here we go. Part 2, background, review, and the history, the Magna Carta. Here we go. Now I've put on my royal robes to show you that this was about the monarchy and the power of the monarchy. The monarchy at this time wasn't doing a good job. King James was forced to sign the Magna Carta, and then it was reissued and edited and reissued and changed over time. But it was an issue about fundamentally limiting the power of the monarchy. So now the monarch, the king or queen, is no longer absolute. Their powers are limited by this big law called the Magna Carta, with several exciting limitations. Dig deep, take a look at what these limitations are. One example would be you have a right to a trial with a jury of your peers before you get punished with having your property confiscated and going to prison. Why is the Magna Carta a cause of the French Revolution? Not directly, but it's more of an inspirational idea out there where, a neighboring country, the English, have come up with this idea in Great Britain of limiting the power of the monarch. They've had some revolutions up there, civil wars in England. And therefore, this is a precedent of an idea that it's possible to have a constitutional monarchy. And so therefore, some people in France would be aware of this idea and also want this for the country of France. A quick lightning review of the English Civil War. King James I of England, aka the Fourth of Scotland, wrote the True Law of Free Monarchs. He wrote about why the kings should have absolute power. Now this gets a little bit confusing because is he King James I or the Fourth? Google that. But basically, he wanted the kings to have absolute power based on divine right. Later on, Charles followed in his footsteps with his beliefs, wanting kings to have absolute power. The people didn't like the way he was ruling. There was a war. He was put on treason. He was beheaded. So this set also a precedent that the French would have been aware of, where the English have put their king on trial for treason and have cut off the head of an English king. Now, a little side piece of this history was that eventually there was another change where the English decided to bring back the monarchy, but this issue of having a revolution against the king was already existing in history with precedent. Now for this next section, we got a guest speaker coming in. Mr. T-Dog is coming into town. All right, Mr. T-Dog, just between you and me, T-Dog. T stands for Tony. Yo, Mr. T-Dog is in the house here to talk to you about revolution and power. However, Mr. T-Dog is a little bit old and needs his reading glasses. Okay, 7 Years' War. France spent a lot of money on the 7 Years' War and lost. France built forts and defenses in North America, including Fort Louisbourg in Canada, in Nova Scotia. Battle of the Plains of Abraham happened in Quebec. Why was this significant? The French lost, the British won, Marquis of Montcalm died, and some French people felt very upset about this and wanted revenge, and so they were motivated to advise the King of France to spend money on the American Revolution, to spend even more money to get revenge on the British. And eventually, the French government spent so much money on the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution that France went bankrupt. Here is the great famous painting that you'll see in many textbooks about the death of General Wolfe on the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Now, if you take a look at this great painting, you will see that they are making him into a hero. How are they doing that? They are painting it in a style where it's similar to religious paintings, where it's similar to paintings of taking Christ off the cross. That would be religious painting seen in church. This flagpole that you see in the center of the image is similar to where a crucifix would be in a religious painting. So they're saying in this painting that General Wolfe is a great hero. Ideologies that you should be aware of: imperialism, colonialism, and mercantilism. These all relate to the idea of the system of empire building that was going on, where Britain wanted to grow its empire in North America because of imperialism, colonialism, and mercantilism. And they needed more colonies for the purpose of trade and economics from the economic theory of mercantilism. So France and Britain were colliding with each other, having wars and conflicts over these issues. Imperialism, they both wanted to grow their empires, they both wanted more land. Colonialism, they both wanted more colonies. And mercantilism, they both wanted to grow the wealth of their empires. Okay, we've been talking about spending. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, the one that said, "I am the state," he spent money on the Palace of Versailles, the Versailles Palace, as well as fortresses in North America. Extravagant, luxurious, a radical wealth inequality between the great king and the poverty of the people. Now, don't mix up Louis XIV with Louis XVI, but Louis XVI spent money on the American Revolution to show the strength and glory of France. France on the world stage and get vengeance on the British. This led to more financial problems and eventually bankruptcy. Part 3, ideas, thinkers, and Enlightenment philosophers. Okay, there were various philosophers arguing different points of view, some agreeing with each other, some disagreeing. Hobbes disagreed with Locke. For example, Locke disagreed with Hobbes in terms of their philosophies were very different. John Locke and Rousseau would have agreed that people have a right to revolt against a tyrannical king, where Hobbes would have said no. Once the king is established, there's a social contract. Yes, he agrees there is a social contract, but he would say that that social contract is a binding contract that cannot be broken. Now, the king should be and is all-powerful, according to Hobbes, and that is for the safety and security of people in the country. And therefore, absolute monarchy is needed, according to Thomas Hobbes, to have a great country that is safe and secure and effective. Otherwise, people would tear each other apart. Where John Locke thought that people had the right to liberty, property. They had fundamental rights or natural rights, life, liberty, and property, were your fundamental rights or your natural rights that you should have. And the whole purpose of government was to protect your rights to life, liberty, and property in something called a social contract. And if the government is not doing their job to protect your life, liberty, and property, they're in breach of their contract. And if they're also being a tyrant, then you have the right to revolt. Voltaire, well, we'll come back to Voltaire, but basically he leaned on the idea of some element of human rights, sometimes not, sometimes yes for human rights, but leaning more on the side of an absolute monarch, but moving forward for his time on some human rights. Montesquieu, he wanted to have something like a constitutional monarchy, but also have branches of government where the branches would have shared power, and the government would move away from all the power being in the hands of one individual human being. While we're on the topic of philosophical ideas and philosophers, we should also give a shout out to the great famous female philosopher Olympe de Gouges, who responded with a piece of writing during the French Revolution, The Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, in response to the rights of man and the citizen, to really declare that the French Revolution should include women getting rights. Note, Olympe de Gouges was beheaded during the French Revolution, and it took a lot of time for women to get the rights that she was writing about. Okay, so we mentioned already social contract. Rousseau believed in this idea of a social contract. He was pro-nature versus civilization. He was romantic in his philosophy. Some philosophers disagreed with him. Voltaire disagreed with Rousseau. He leaned towards feeling versus realism and reason and empirical evidence. Voltaire advocated for some justice and human rights, but he was pro-absolute monarchy. Now, when I say some justice and some human rights, some people consider for his time period a very serious advocate for justice and human rights, but where it falls short and doesn't necessarily mean all is in this issue of slavery in the colonies. And so this is an issue for many philosophers and thinkers in France where, oh wait, all people should be equal, but what about the slaves in Haiti making sugar for the French Empire, which translates into money for the French Empire? Ooh, we really need that money. That money is important for the power of the French Empire. So there's this issue about what about people who are not citizens of France proper, living in Europe. Okay, Montesquieu. Another thing you should remember about Montesquieu is the monarch should consult with elected people, which is a type of constitutional monarchy. And he advocated for branches. Branches, I should also mention, are important in both Canada and the United States today. In the United States, the branches would be the legislative branch would be the Congress and the Senate. The executive branch would be the President, and the Supreme Court of the United States would be the judicial branch. In Canada, we would have the Parliament made up of the House of Commons and the Senate being the legislative branch, which in some level would include the Prime Minister, but also the Prime Minister would be part of the executive branch and the government and the ministers he appoints. To some extent, the Governor General would be part of the executive branch, but now the Governor General of Canada is more ceremonial and symbolic. But on paper, the Governor General is theoretically part of the executive branch. And the Supreme Court of Canada would be the judicial branch. So the executive branch has the power to make immediate decisions. The judicial branch has the power to make laws. And the legislative branch has the power to make laws. The judicial branch judges and interprets the law in the court system. Okay, I'm going too fast. Okay, here we go. We got Olympe de Gouges here in blue, and we've got some other famous paintings. We've got one of the paintings of Marat being assassinated. We're going to come back to that one later on, but I should mention, while we're on this spot here, that Charlotte Corday was the assassin. So there was this exciting story about a female assassin during the French Revolution. So there was a role for women during the French Revolution. From being writers like Olympe de Gouges, who wrote about women's rights philosophically, and made a really important contribution, one of the great early feminists, and other roles. We should also mention that there were the women of the fish market. We're going to come back to that later. Okay, poor leadership. Part 4. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and perhaps their advisors. Perhaps there was some poor leadership, and this was a huge cause or confounding problem of the French Revolution. Perhaps if the leadership was stronger, this revolution could have been avoided. The leadership of the monarchy, they became king and queen very young. They were not prepared, not well educated for their roles, at least not enough considering the problems they had. They were not very curious to take on more learning for themselves. They didn't have a vision of possible realities that they could bring in, for example, radical tax reform. They were reactive versus proactive. The king made a decision to lock the doors of the three estates. That was probably a critical mistake that made people really upset. And he was reluctant to do the tax reform that was needed. And at one point, maybe it was too late at this point, but he attempted to leave the country of France. Perhaps it was too late. Perhaps the revolution had already started and was already well on its way. But that event of attempting to leave the country of France definitely made people turn against the king, where they wanted not just to reduce his power, but now they wanted to put him on trial for treason and have him executed. Part 5, the crisis. The French Revolution begins. When did it start? The 5th May, 1789. 1789, May the 5th. Why that date? Well, that was because of the events that were happening. May 5th, 1789, the king opens the meeting of the Estates General. This is considered by most historians the start of the French Revolution. However, it had been starting for a while, and perhaps a great leader could have stopped it still, could have turned it around, could have solved the problem at this point in time. But this is a date given for the start of the French Revolution by many historians. Why did the king open the meeting of the Estates General? France is bankrupt. France needs tax reform. The voting structure is flawed. Okay, the Third Estate, which is most of the population, somewhere between 90 and 97% of the population, only gets 1/3 of the voting power. And the Second and First Estate, somewhere between, let's say, 5 to 3% of the population, gets 66% of the voting power. The king locks the doors. Why? This was a huge mistake. It made people upset. It made the commoners so upset, the Third Estate, that they left and found somewhere else to meet. This is probably where the revolution really got going, because they went to a place that's often called a tennis court, but basically we could call it a gymnasium, somewhere for playing some type of sport. And they made a promise, an oath, to create and write a constitution. So then it took time to write the constitution after that, but they immediately took a promise to write a constitution. Okay, things heat up. July 11th, 1789, the king suddenly dismisses Jacques Necker for no reason. Who was Jacques Necker? He was both praised and criticized by historians. Connections. When you are the boss, do not fire talented and popular people who have solutions to your problems. One day you may be the leader, the boss of some organization. Think about how you lead. Having good advisors is incredibly important. 14th July, 1789, storming of the Bastille. At dawn on July 14th, a great crowd armed with muskets, swords, and various makeshift weapons began to gather around the Bastille. Lanné's men were able to hold off the mob back, but more and more Parisians were converging on the Bastille. Lanné raised a white flag of surrender over the fortress. Lanné and his men were taken into custody. The Bastille's gunpowder and the cannons were seized, and 7 prisoners were freed. Upon arriving at Hotel de Ville, where Lanné was to be arrested and tried by a revolution council, he was instead pulled away by a mob and murdered. This is from History.com. (1789) The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Article 17. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. Okay, notice what's missing. Women are missing, which is why Olympe de Gouges responded with the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. The other issue is this wasn't equally applied out into the colonies. Number 2, the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Which one of these rights do you think is the most important and why? Feel free to pause and discuss. Pause and discuss. Google the rights from the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and discuss which rights do you value the most. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Restart the video now. Here we go. After you have discussed the rights outlined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen with a partner. Continue the video. And here we go to the Women's March to Versailles. And remember, women had a role. So they were really angry because they heard about stuff from Marat newspaper. Now, Jean-Paul Marat could be pronounced Marat by some people in the English language. The T is often silent in the end of French words, unless there's an E after the T. So Jean-Paul Marat would have been how people would have pronounced his name in the French language, or at least something like that. Okay, women demanded the king return to Paris. Okay, this is where the June 20th to 21st, 1791, the royal family flees to Paris. Now, I skipped over something there. What I should say is that after the women march to Versailles, they demand that the king and queen move from Versailles to the city of Paris, and they do that for a while, but then they flee later on. The trial and execution of the king, King Louis XVI, is put on trial. What are the ethics and morality about this trial? What are the justifications and the arguments? Is the trial lawful? What's your opinion about the trial? Pause and discuss. Can a king be put on trial for treason? Can a president be put on trial for treason? Pause and discuss. Should a prime minister or president be subject to the laws of the land and be able to be arrested and put on trial for their actions? Or should they be immune from prosecution while they are president or prime minister? And should they be immune from prosecution after they finish their service in office for a crime they committed while they were in office? Part 6, the people, the French Revolution, Marat, Robespierre, and Lafayette. Okay, Marat, he had a skin illness. He got this skin illness because he was poor and homeless, and he lived in a sewer. And while he was living in these pipes under the city, he picked up a skin illness from the bacteria or parasites in the sewer system. This means he had to have medical treatments, a special bath for his skin illness. This was why he is depicted in these paintings having this bath where he is writing while sitting in a bathtub. He wrote very radical revolutionary articles demanding more radical actions. Another key person, Maximilien Robespierre. He's really important because he was the leader and orator, a key leader on the Committee of Public Safety, one of the 12 people that ruled France through the rule of terror. Not to confuse this committee with something that is really about public safety, but this was basically the ruling committee. Now, this issue of the Reign of Terror is incredibly important, that this was a terrible time, not a popular or fun time to be in as part of the revolution, where people were getting their head cut off and being accused of not being a proper ally of the revolution. And eventually people were so afraid and so fed up with this Reign of Terror that they said, Maximilian, enough's enough, we're upset with you, we don't want you anymore, we're cutting off your head, to end the Reign of Terror, because basically he was considered responsible for this Reign of Terror. Another person who is more of a hero is Lafayette, a noble-born revolutionary. Somebody who was nobility, who wanted to support the revolution. How did he get involved? Well, he was really passionate about the American Revolution, partly perhaps for the cause of the American Revolution, but partly perhaps because he wanted to get revenge on the British for his father being killed in the 7 Years' War. He went to join the American Revolution to avenge his father's death. By 1780, the Major General Lafayette was commanding nearly 2,200 American troops and was viewed as the official representative of France to the United States of America, or these United States. He eventually negotiated for France to deliver substantial numbers of troops, and in 1781, 1,800 French sailors arrived. Lafayette marched his troops to Yorktown, where the British had decamped on a large portion of its army. On October 6th, the Allies attacked, and by noon, October 19th, the British surrendered in what was to be their largest defeat. It was a resounding victory led by Washington, but impossible without Lafayette. So Lafayette is a hero of both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Therefore, you will find places like an elementary school named after Lafayette in the United States of America. Returning to France, Lafayette's love for liberty led him to join the noblemen who favored a revolution of their own. After the revolutionaries stormed the Bastille in 1789, Lafayette was made commander-in-chief of the new National Guard, organized to safeguard the revolution's secure place in France. This quote is from Lafayette.org. The causes, Part 7, evaluate. Which two do you think are the most important and significant? Or which one cause do you think is the most important? Or two, depending on what you think. Possible causes, but which ones are the most important? Pause and discuss. Feel free to pause the video and discuss with a partner. Moving on, here we go. Possible categories of the causes. Historical events that set the stage. Finances and overspending. Finances, unfair taxes, and the unfair tax system. Under finances, you could also discuss other issues. Ideas and the Enlightenment and the ideas that encouraged people to revolt. Also, the inspirational ideas of other types of government. And then number 5, inequality. Inequality in wealth, inequality in power, and inequality of wealth. So number 5 could be split up to 3 additional subcategories. And then the famine caused by the severe winter weather. And number 7, poor leadership. Part 9. Part 9, the global impact and legacy. So the French Revolution is so important to learn about because it is a huge landmark event in world history. Many countries look to the French Revolution for inspiration and guidance for other revolutions and other events. So, here are some of the lasting impacts. Napoleon invaded many countries to spread these ideas. And it helped spread the ideas. Sometimes it was in the name of spreading the revolution to free the people from oppression. Number 2, Napoleon invaded Spain, which gave opportunity for colonial revolutions. So this is a huge triggering event, which means because Spain was occupied by Napoleon, the colonies of the Spanish Empire could declare independence and have their own independence revolutions. And so this shook up the whole Spanish empire colonial system. Napoleon ordered the creation of a legal code which inspired many countries, a system of codified law. This codified law system still has impact on many countries around the world, including places like Quebec and France. Number 4, the Haitian Revolution. The rights of slaves started advancing and being questioned. And the slaves wanted the equality that was valued in the French Revolution. And there's a whole complicated story about the story of Haiti. Take a look at that with your teacher. but we're going to focus on continuing down this list about the global impact of the French Revolution. Human rights inspired. So the French Revolution and the document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman. These documents inspired human rights all over the world. Slowly over time, they inspired certain countries to take certain steps, which eventually inspired the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which then later inspired human rights for Canada in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which eventually entered Canadian Constitution in 1982. So, human rights came slowly to the rest of the world. It wasn't an instant thing, but it slowly trickled all over the place. Okay, another big idea that came out of the French Revolution was the separation of church and state. In French, the word is called laïcité, and this is a very complex word, but we could summarize it as the separation of church and state. You can Google this in the news in France and Quebec. It's a complicated and controversial term, and a Canadian connection to this term would be to Google Bill 21, which is where this value of laïcité, the separation of church and state, can sometimes be a problem where some people argue its implementation will trample on the rights of minorities. Okay, number 8, Canadian connection law, Quebec. Okay, so Quebec still keeps some traditions of the codified law, civil code in Quebec. And so this, the French Revolution, the legal system that came out of that still has an impact today on the lives of Canadian citizens in the province of Quebec. Okay, we got a map of France. And there we get to the end of our presentation for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this video helpful for studying about the French Revolution. Now it's time for Mr. T-Dog to take off his reading glasses. Woohoo! And create a goodbye moment. Jean-Paul Marat, for the people, the French Revolution. It is time for the people to rise up and get equality and dignity. All right. What do you think? Was it worth it? Was the French Revolution ethically justified? The French Revolution and many other revolutions have a serious problem with the loss of life. People are killed. That's a big tragedy. Some philosophers, like Edmund Burke, would argue, in light of this danger of the loss of life, change should come about slowly and incrementally while respecting the traditions and systems of politics of the past. The institutions, the rule of law should all be respected while change comes about slowly, according to the philosopher Edmund Burke. What do you think? Should change come around quickly at the risk of chaos and danger? Or should change come around slowly? Okay, don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this video helpful to your learning. Yes! Okay. Stay calm. Stay safe. Be kind. Say something nice to somebody today. And study. Keep learning. Ask great questions.